Hello everyone. My name is David Neal. I am the Chambers researcher and a former barrister here at Garden Court Chambers. Thank you all very much for coming to this webinar. Please note this event is being live streamed and recorded. The recording will be uploaded to our YouTube channel with the link and slides sent to all attendees. Now, the format we're going to have is our panelists are each going to speak. Then we're going to have time for questions. If you could put your questions in the Q&A box, and I'll select some questions at the end to put to our panelists, time permitting. We're aiming to finish about 6:30. We're going to be talking about our experiences as neurodivergent people with a variety of different neurodivergences in the legal sector, our own experiences and the challenges we faced, and the benefits and drawbacks of neurodivergence in the legal profession, and how ableism and institutional barriers can affect us. We've got some great speakers today. I'm afraid that Michael Turner KC wasn't able to join us, but we've got my colleague Paul, who is a barrister here at Garden Court, who's passionate about environmental justice and the natural world. We've got Ravi from TV Edwards, who's a solicitor specializing in children law with extensive experience of representing neurodivergent children. And we've got Mark, who is a solicitor at DPG Solicitors, with higher rights of audience, specializing in public law and human rights. So we've got a wide range of professional experience on this panel, and as you're going to hear, a wide range of neurodivergent experiences as well. So I'm going to speak first, and then I'm going to pass over to each of the panelists in turn. And as I say, we'll then have room for questions at the end. So I'm autistic. I was diagnosed at the age of 25 after struggling with various mental health problems for many years. I was a practicing barrister from 2014 to 2017, specializing in immigration and asylum. And I'm going to be honest, being a barrister really wasn't for me. I found it overwhelming. I struggled with the unpredictability of court hearings. I had a particularly miserable time during my pupillage when I had to do criminal magistrates court work and youth court trials that I was wholly woefully unprepared for, didn't know what I was doing, and I felt completely overwhelmed by that. Once I completed pupillage, I moved into doing exclusively immigration and asylum, and I was initially a squatter. I eventually got a tenancy in Chambers, but I struggled with that as well, to be honest. When I made a mistake or something went wrong in a case, I felt intensely guilty, and this was greatly exacerbated by the fact that most of my work was asylum, where the stakes are literally life and death. I struggled with guilt, I struggled with anxiety, I struggled with the level of responsibility, and I also struggled with the unmanageable workload that is expected of self-employed barristers. And I struggled with finances, because being self-employed, particularly in the early part of your career, and if you're doing primarily legal aid work, is very challenging. Taxes are very challenging. And fundamentally, I just couldn't handle life as a self-employed barrister. I felt constantly inadequate. I felt like I wasn't good enough and was letting my clients down. And in 2017, I had something of a breakdown and took several months off sick. Now, I was lucky enough to be exceptionally well supported by my colleagues, particularly my colleague Catherine Cronin, and I was lucky enough to be given the opportunity at the beginning of 2018 to move into my current role as the Chambers researcher at Garden Court. This is a non-practicing role. I don't have a practicing certificate. I support barristers in their work. I carry out legal research. I draft pleadings and skeleton arguments. I advise barristers on strategy. I carry out country research for asylum cases. I'm involved in a very wide variety of stuff. Although my specialism is immigration, asylum, and nationality, I do work in other practice areas as well in my current role. One thing I'm known for in the sector is my work with Breaking the Chains, which seeks to improve legal outcomes for Albanian asylum-seeking children and young people. I put my country analysis and research skills to good use in debunking the Home Office country policy and information notes and demonstrating that the Home Office is cherry picking and distorting the evidence in order to downplay the risks to Albanians. And this has allowed us to secure asylum for significant numbers of vulnerable Albanian children and young people. And this is a very vulnerable cohort. These are young people who often, if they're refused, will end up becoming street homeless and being trafficked. That's been important work, and I've been very lucky to have the opportunity to do that. I fell into it largely by accident, but I've been very lucky to be part of something that's really meaningfully changed outcomes for this particular cohort, and it's become particularly important in the last year or two when we've seen a coordinated assault on Albanian asylum seekers by the Home Office and by senior politicians and sections of the media, and there's been some media interest in my work. I field queries from journalists a lot these days. So that's ended up being something where I've been able to make a real contribution. My own experience as a disabled person has made me feel strongly about disability in the asylum system, and in particular the completely spurious way that the Home Office assesses the credibility of asylum seekers. And with Jennifer Blair, I co-authored the publication Bridging a Protection Gap about disability and asylum law. And I've also been lucky enough to become a co-editor of the last edition and the forthcoming edition of MacDonald's Immigration Law and Practice, and the forthcoming new edition of Fransman's British Nationality Law. I'm co-authoring that. I've drafted opposition amendments that have been debated in Parliament, and I've even been able to do work in other jurisdictions. Like I do a lot of work in the Caribbean. I was involved in the John Mussington Barbuda Airport case that you may have seen in the news recently. I was involved in an immigration judicial review in the Falkland Islands, which was quite exciting. I am lucky that due to the exceptionally good support I've received from Chambers, I have been able to use my skills to contribute in important ways and have been able to achieve a large number of things. But I would say that my autism has both benefits and drawbacks as far as my work is concerned. The greatest benefit is that I process written information very fast and I'm able to work quickly. It's not uncommon for me to draft a 6,000-word article or a 6,000-word document in half a day. The difficulty is, however, when I read, I sometimes miss important details. And this was the source of some of the mistakes I made when I was in practice, and that's still a problem for me. Sometimes I will read a bundle and I will get the gist of what's going on in the case very quickly, but sometimes I'll miss crucial details. And one of the things that precipitated my breakdown in 2017 was when, in an asylum case, I missed a detail in some medical records and allowed them to go in, and they ended up damaging the case. And I just felt immensely guilty about that. And I'm being honest about that as a professional failing. I'm also not the best when it comes to social skills, and I struggled, I have to say, with the unpredictable environment of the courtroom, dealing with judges, dealing with clients, dealing with opposing counsel or presenting officers. And I'm incredibly glad that I don't have to do that anymore. And even though I'm heavily involved in casework, I'm not going to court and doing advocacy anymore. And the fact is, my mental and emotional health, although they're better than there were, are often pretty poor. I struggle with low self-esteem and lack of confidence. I know it may not seem like it after I've just listed a bunch of my achievements, but I have a persistent doubt that I'm really good enough. And the fact is, in some respects, I do find things difficult and I do make mistakes. And the fact is that my lack of confidence and self-doubt and my limitations have held me back a great deal, and probably always will. I'm never likely to achieve the professional heights that I might appear to be capable of on paper. I'm not going to ever take silk or become a high court judge or whatever. That's not realistically going to happen. I'm being rather too candid about these matters because I think it's important to present an honest picture of neurodivergence in the legal profession. Many neurodivergent people do achieve great things and flourish in law, and that's wonderful to see. It's important to bear in mind that not only is neurodivergence a broad umbrella term for a large variety of things, but also every autistic is different, every person with ADHD is different, and some people do flourish in this profession and achieve great things. And this is a wonderful thing to see. But my own experience has been a real mixed bag. I've been immensely lucky to be incredibly well supported at Garden Court. It's the most supportive environment I could wish for. And I'm lucky enough to have this job where I'm able to put my skills and abilities to good use and make a real difference without stressing me out to a level I can't manage, and where I'm able to have a salary and working hours and paid holidays and all the things that you don't have at the self-employed bar. Because the fact is that there is a limit to how much work and how much stress and pressure I can handle. And the expectations in the legal profession, both in the self-employed bar and for solicitors, are simply unmanageable for someone with my level of mental health difficulties. So that's the unvarnished truth, so to speak. And I hope I've presented a balanced picture. I'm not trying to blow my own trumpet, but I'm equally very keen not to downplay the difficulties I've faced and the ways in which, in some ways, my disability has held me back in success in the legal profession. And this is certainly not intending to be a discouragement to neurodivergent people who are starting out in their legal careers, or who are students who are looking to enter a legal career, because, as I say, I think you can achieve great things. I've achieved quite a lot of things, but I have to be honest about the fact that there are a lot of barriers. Some of those are structural and social barriers. Some of those are to do with institutionalized ableism. Some of them are to do with the work culture and the expectations of unmanageable working hours. And some of them are simply to do with the inherent characteristics of the job and the ways in which I just wasn't suited to it. And I apologize that this has been a bit of a ramble, but I'm going to hand over now to Mark, who I believe has prepared some slides.
Thanks, David. Yeah, I have some slides. I'm not sure if they're going to pop up or if I have to do that awkward next slide thing, but hopefully people can see them. Is that being done in the background?
Anusha, could we have the slides, please? Alternatively, Mark, you can share your screen and put them on your.
If I do that, then everyone will realise that when I printed off the slides to present, I forgot to print off the notes, which are now on the screen instead. But that's like Neurodivergence live, so you're welcome for seeing that. But I can crack on.
Oh yeah, the slides are coming now. There we go.
Great. Okay, thank you. Yeah, so
is it metatextual commentary? The seminar itself is a commentary on how neurodivergence affects our work.
Yeah, so just to say thank you for inviting me to speak. I feel very passionately about this, as I think all the speakers do. As a person, as a neurodivergent person who works in law, I'm a solicitor. I specialize in public law and human rights litigation. I do a lot of work in the immigration detention estate. And yeah, so great to speak. But what strikes me is whenever we talk about neurodiversity, we talk in broad terms, and we use terminology which maybe isn't familiar to everyone. It is familiar to people who are maybe directly affected by it, but one of the things I'm really passionate about doing is increasing awareness and education, because I think that's one of the solutions to creating a more inclusive legal sector. So what I'm going to do in the next slide, if we just see that, is talk through some basic definitions. I'll let you read on the screen, but just a disclaimer, I don't have loads of time to talk, and I could talk about this for hours. So I will try to be quite quick going through slides, but I'm happy for them to be circulated as well if people want to request them. So yeah, so neurodiversity, I think is helpful to think of it as a noun. We think of diversity. It's not, somebody isn't neuro diverse because you describe a group as diverse, don't you? So it's neurodiversity is certainly, this is the way I use the terminology, but I have no authority over it. Neurodiversity, that concept of a diverse group, including neurodivergent and neurotypical individuals. Neurotypical people, that's the status quo, or the norm, the majority of people who are not neurodivergent. And I'll stress, although it's the norm, I don't say that from a sort of qualitative or value-based judgment. That's just the majority of people in the world are neurotypical. Neurodivergent, people who diverge, whose brain diverges from what is considered the norm. This can arise from genetic, genetic conditions, neurodivergent conditions, ADHD, autism, dyslexia. It can result from brain-altering experiences, trauma, head injuries, brain damage, mental ill health, or a combination of the two. Very often, neurodivergent people have comorbid conditions, so that means they are more susceptible to additional mental health conditions or other neurodivergent conditions. So it's not just one condition that they're affected by. If we go on to the next slide, that is my experience as well. So I have a diagnosis of ADHD and OCD. My OCD was diagnosed when I was 11. I had experiences, and everybody comes to the sector and the job with your own lived experiences. I think that's really important to recognize. And as a result of those, developed OCD at a young age. But what really should have been noticeable to the healthcare practitioners and people around me was that the OCD, whilst manifesting in the really overt way, was masking what was really alongside it, which was the ADHD. I didn't get diagnosed with ADHD until I was 2021, in the last year of my university degree. As a result, my degree suffered. I rescued it a bit, but I got help with ADHD, and that's one of the great things about ADHD. You can get help, and there are some very successful interventions. But going through your whole education without the right support or knowing how to learn can leave lasting complications. But just to sort of touch on ADHD, it's a neurodevelopmental condition. I think a lot of people think of it as fidgety boys who are misbehaving. Obviously, that's a stigma, one of the issues that we have. It's not that, and contrary to the it's one of the worst named conditions. I think because it suggests that there's an attention deficit, whereas ADHD has got nothing to do with a deficit in attention. It is to do with the regulation of attention. And so, yeah, ADHD, OCD, another highly stigmatized condition, one which I've struggled for a long time with around the shame talking about, because there's this perception, certainly I've had from a young age, that you're the mad one, and people perceive it to be all external. But I don't present with any external OCD behaviors or manifestations. So it's important to recognize how both symptoms of ADHD and OCD, whilst they can be externalized, they can also be internalized. And the lack of understanding around that is often why a lot of people don't get diagnosed, or they don't associate with these conditions. If we can go on to the next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about my experience of working as a solicitor with a neurodivergent condition. I, like others, want to focus on more of the difficulties because I think it's fair to present a realistic assessment of the legal sector that we work in. But it's also really important to recognise that whether it's because of or it is related to my ADHD and OCD, I don't know, but there are a lot of things that I am good at, and I know that there are some of those things I do definitely have a connection with my ADHD. Improved relationship with clients, creative thinking, classical ADHD things, and one thing I just want to touch on is this concept of the group IQ. So ADHD, other neurodivergent conditions, they aren't linked to IQ. It's not a learning disability per se. So one which is measured by an IQ less than 70, for example, being a cutoff point. These are conditions that affect how we interact with the world, but not our intelligence at the core. And there's a really interesting 2011 study on neurodivergent groups or neurodiverse groups where ADHD people were put into groups of otherwise neurotypical people, and then there was groups of solely neurotypical people, and both were given two complex problems to solve, and the outcomes of the study showed that 88% of the neurodiverse group, so the groups including people with ADHD, solved all of the problems, and 0% of the exclusively neurotypical groups solved the problems. So that is to say that neurodiversity, so the inclusion of both ADHD neurodivergent conditions amongst other neurotypical people, has a net benefit for everyone, because and particularly if you view intelligence as a group, as an organization, I think that's really important, despite us living in an increasingly individualistic society. Progress is achieved by groups, and so I think it's important to recognize the correlation between intelligence between exclusively neurotypical groups and neurodiverse groups, and it's the importance of diversity. It's not just for the sake of it. It's not wokeism or anything like that. There's a genuine benefit to diversity. So we just move on to the next slide, please. Here I have listed some of the definitions, which I've taken from a really helpful article done by some Cambridge professors about some of the symptoms of ADHD, how it presents, and there's masking. I'm not going to read the whole definitions, but to skim through the masking, basically hiding your symptoms, hyperfocus, becoming obsessed with a piece of work, time blindness, not having a concept of temporal passage of time, stimming, repetitive actions, executive dysfunction. That's really what ADHD is, or per organization, per working memory, task initiation and shifting. I think what better than giving these definitions is to describe how this arises for me. So even after disclosing my neurodivergent conditions to colleagues, to organizations that I've worked at, I have sometimes felt like I can't ask for support, don't want to ask for support. I mask the impact of my condition because I don't want to be that burden. I don't want to be difficult. It's there's also the sense that you're going to be excluded, and so masking feeds into invisibility. And one of the key things that I would really like people to take away from today's talk is that these are conditions, neurodivergent conditions, and whether or not people identify as being disabled, I do. I think that's a great thing. I'm not ashamed of. But these are invisible conditions or invisible disabilities. And so people don't see you as neurodivergent until you tell them. But if you don't tell them, or if you don't tell them the impact, and that may be for a variety of reasons, including barriers to disclosure, they don't know. And that masking plays a big role in it. But if you're trying to work so hard to hide the impact of your condition, you're working extra. you're not getting support that you're entitled to, and you're more susceptible to burnout. You're more susceptible to overworking, and it's exhausting and things like that. So I just really stress that just because people, don't identify straight out in front of everyone as neurodivergent, it doesn't mean it isn't there. It doesn't mean that it's really significant, and it has a really significant impact on them. And we should be trying to create a more inclusive sector so that people can talk about it, so that people don't have to mask as much, and so that working in this sector is generally more sustainable as well as inclusive. But yeah, just on hyper focusing as well. People maybe have this perception that it's a great thing, focusing on something for that undisturbed amount of time. Side effects: you forget to go to the toilet, you forget to have lunch. You get to the end of the day, it's 10 p.m., it's 3 a.m. You realize that you've been doing something for 12 hours. Your body is exhausted again. Those are the hidden things that people don't see, and you don't shout about it. You don't tell people because you don't want it to seem like you can't manage. But yeah, if we just go on to the next slide, I'm conscious of time. So when I talk about the invisibility, and one of the difficulties of neurodivergent conditions being invisible is that unless you disclose your condition, then you're not going to get support. And there are so many barriers to disclosure in this sector. This isn't even sector specific. This is in all workplaces. That you're more likely to not make that disclosure. If you don't make the disclosure, you don't get the support. If you don't get the support, you continue to mask, overwork, and eventually, burn out, suffer poor mental health, feel like you can't work in the profession, when you could be a brilliant lawyer, but you keep running yourself to the ground. Whereas if you felt like you were able to disclose, get the right support, that wouldn't happen. So for me, I've talked about shame, embarrassment. There's feelings of inadequacy, and I think my ADHD, there was a long association with me feeling stupid because up until the age of 20, I couldn't really read books. I could read, but I'd read half a book and I'd never finish it. And when you do that so many times, it's a bit demoralizing. And started getting help, started taking medication for ADHD. Suddenly was reading books, and I felt like I needed to make up because I lacked intelligence or I lacked knowledge. But those feelings of inadequacy kind of feed into why I didn't disclose in different workplaces that I've been at. When I did first disclose it after uni, I was working in a human rights context. I was told in a leaving interview that they almost didn't give me the job because they thought that my ADHD would be too difficult to manage. They thought of all the stigmas and thought that's how it would present in the office. And so they were telling me when I was leaving this organization expressly that we almost didn't hire you because of your ADHD. Now, obviously, that would be unlawful, but we know these things happen. And I remember years later talking about this with a senior colleague in another organization, and them saying, I don't know if I would have hired you if you disclosed that. I didn't disclose it in my next job application, and as I progressed, 2 years before telling anyone about it, I was then confronted with, I don't know if I would have hired you either. So there's this constant thing, and I know people think that's being honest and helpful, but that's coupled with people telling you constantly, oh, you're not ADHD. I don't believe you're ADHD. Or don't go into the kitchen, it's a bit messy at the minute, it might trigger your OCD. That's not my condition. That's not how I present. Those aren't symptoms I have. And whenever people disbelieve you, there's a chilling effect. It's relying on stigmas about how conditions present, rather than the individualized effect on me as a person. And it's quite belittling, but also then there's the effect of that, which is you don't feel able to ask for support because you've been told you're managing, and if your workplace thinks you're managing wherever you're at, they're not going to, you know, provide you with more support, you know, a cost and expense. So yeah, those are my experiences of disclosure at different places. And I now take as liberal and transparent approach to disclosure as I can, as I'm trying to increase awareness about neurodivergent conditions. And on that, I just want to emphasize that we may have different neurodivergent conditions, but within that, even if we have the same neurodivergent conditions, we may have different symptoms. And even if we have the same symptoms, we may have a different lived experience, a different age of diagnosis, which means that we, you know, have interpreted the world with or without support for different periods of time. There are so many factors that come into play, which just goes to show that one neurodivergent person is not the same as another. I know it's a classic phrase, and you know, one autistic person isn't, you know, once you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. I think that's true of all neurodivergent people. If we just go to the next slide, and these are kind of my key takeaway points from the talk. Invisibility, that is the problem. You know, neurotypical people don't see, and therefore understand. You know, understandably, they don't see the issues, and unless we tell them, then they're not going to appreciate the need for change. But there has to be a culture that welcomes change, and you know, that's where this is not just the job of neurodivergent people to increase awareness. There has to be a willingness to change as well. But you know, invisible conditions with extensive stigmas, with our own personal lived experience of negative experiences on making disclosures, disbelief, because neurotypical people can't empathize with their struggles. You know, all of those things create long-lasting barriers to disclosure. And you know, in organizations where somebody discloses it isn't received well, others are less likely to. So yeah, invisibility, barriers to disclosure, really big concepts to understand. The result of barriers to disclosure being that neurodivergent people have justifiable fears of making disclosure and don't. They don't get support. And a prerequisite for inclusion, we talk about inclusive organizations and workplaces. Prerequisite for inclusion is anticipation. If you don't identify that there are these barriers to disclosure, you're always reacting to people raising them with it, you've already failed because there's somebody that hasn't been able to come forward. And just in the end, you know, the right or inclusive environment plus the right support, neurodivergent people flourish through a very, you know, a variety of different ways. And it's just really important to recognize that, you know, neurodiverse organizations will do better than exclusive organizations. Inclusivity is a good thing. And just the last slide is to say, I think just go to the last slide, sorry, Anish. Takeaway points. If you're an employer or an organization and you want to focus on solutions and increasing inclusivity, you know, I think there's a lot of things that can be done. Increasing talking, you know, discourse and things about that, really important. But boil it down into three things: organizational training, increase awareness, decrease the stigma. Number two, neurodiversity policies. We all present in different ways, but there are policies. You can have policies which have a process whereby you identify the individual needs of the neurodivergent person, and how that can be supported, and also how do we play to those strengths in organizations, and then improve support. You know, I speak for myself here. I don't know all the answers for what different support is available for different neurodivergent conditions. I barely know what's available for myself. So it's really important whenever that organizations have somebody who can bring that expertise in and share that. Sorry, I think I've gone way over time, but frankly, that was to be expected with my ADHD. So I'll pass back over to, I think, Ravi or Paul.
Yeah, we're going to hear from Ravi now. Thank you very much, Mark, for that presentation. We're going to hear from Ravi now, and then we're going to go over to Paul for a final word.
Thanks. Thank you. I'm going to pick up, I think, from where Mark's left off and talk a little bit more about being in the profession and then having a diagnosis, as opposed to coming into the profession with a diagnosis. And I think, so just by way of background, I'm 22 years PQE, and I was diagnosed with ADHD and dyscalculia in early 2021. It took me about a year and a half to get to the psychiatrist. I missed 2 appointments. I got away with the first one, and he charged me for the second one, and that made sure I didn't miss the third one. And yeah, it was really interesting. When I got my diagnosis, I was very, very cautious and measured about who I would tell. So there was quite a long period of time where I wasn't telling anyone that I'd been diagnosed. You know, very, very few people knew. But when I did start to tell people, especially my close circle of friends, my immediate family, my close peers at work, I was quite struck by their reaction, which was pretty much, oh, okay, and then silence. So the more I talked about, oh, I've had a diagnosis, and then I was met with silence, it kind of shot me down. And then I started, and you know, with people you work with and with professionals and peers, you tell them about a diagnosis and they're not interested or they don't want to have a conversation, you kind of you shut it off. But when I was having those conversations with close family and friends, we were getting into arguments because they were trying to tell me that I didn't have ADHD. They were trying to tell me that, well, I do that, and you know, I'm always late, and I have time blindness, and I'm disorganized. So no, Ravi, you know, that can't be right. So I went through a period of where I really struggled with how to get it across to people that my diagnosis is real, and that, you know, it's not made up. It's not for you to tell me what I am or I'm not. There was just this whole lack of disregard for what I'd said to them. And I can actually count probably on one hand, probably less than one hand, maybe 2 or 3 people in my entire network, and I mean personally, professionally. I think there were only 2 or 3 people who I told who stood back and said, oh goodness, okay, Ravi, right, I don't know what that means. Can you tell me what that means? And how does this affect you? And what does this mean for you? Because I don't know, I don't know how this affects you. You know, is there anything I need to be thinking about? Is there anything you need to do? There's maybe 2 or 3 people who asked me that question. And the vast majority just, you know, they'd listen and they'd say, okay, and then the conversation quickly moved on. And then in 2022, in early 2022, Resolution contacted me because someone in their committee knew that I'd had this diagnosis. And she said, look, I really want you to come and do a talk at Resolution at the family conference. And I think you need to, you need to talk about your diagnosis. And I remember sitting there thinking, but I haven't told my in-laws, I haven't told, you know, most of my friends, and only a few people at work know, and none of my extended family know. So I felt really cautious about doing it. But then I did the talk in the October of that year. And I remember I went on stage and the lights were really bright, so I couldn't see anything. And it you know, there was an epiphany at that point that I just kind of, you know, I was very truthful. I was very honest about the mental health challenges, the masking, the stimming, the reaction I'd had to my diagnosis, the constant arguments I'm having with people who are telling me I haven't got ADHD, but you can't have ADHD, you're successful, you know, you're married, you've got kids, you're organized, people with ADHD do this and people with ADHD do that. And it was just exhausting. It's one thing myself trying to process that I'm 40 plus years old and I've clearly had difficulties from when I was at nursery, but it wasn't picked up. But it was another to be almost mocked and ridiculed by people who mattered to me. But when I went to the Resolution conference, it was really raw, and I remember sitting there thinking, I'm not going to hold back today, I'm just going to say it as it is. But after that talk, I felt a real change. I had so many people approach me, so many people wanting to know more information. I had emails for about a year afterwards of people telling me that after hearing the talk, they went off and got help and they got a diagnosis, or they had family members who they encouraged to speak out. I had people who, you know, were working in law firms saying, well, we've got a diagnosis and we've never told anyone, we're too scared. And I felt that at that point, I just felt I need to start using my voice a little stronger and a little bit more, because I mustn't be afraid of what people are going to think of me. Because there are a lot of people out there suffering. And I'd spent on and off about 20 years taking medication for anxiety. So the first time I was prescribed with anxiety medication, I think I was 21 or 22. And it continued right through to after having my children. And it was just this constant cycle of I'd get better, then the anxiety would take over. And I realize now in reflection, it wasn't anxiety, it's because I had undiagnosed ADHD. So since diagnosis, I haven't taken any medication, and I'm much better at managing my mental health. I still have difficult, you know, I have a lot of challenges. I'm, you know, trying to work out a lot of things in life, but I know what I'm dealing with and what I'm up against. One of the ironies, and I really want to talk about this, one of the ironies about me being diagnosed with ADHD is I work with children and I work with adults who have autism and ADHD. So I put my hands up to this, and I will call out a lot of my peers who work with children and families in public law proceedings, that I thought I knew what ADHD was. I thought I knew what autism was, and I'd sit there thinking, yeah, you know, that's not me. You know, it never occurred to me that I couldn't see any of the kind of similarities in behavior. And it was it was really interesting that when I was telling people within the profession that I had ADHD, they couldn't see it. And so it really struck me that maybe as someone who represents children directly, who advocates for children, you know, it really hit me that I couldn't see it in me, or, you know, in my own challenges. You know, so how would I expect other people to understand it? And so I was very, you know, I'm very critical of myself for my failures in that as well, in that, you know, working in a profession, reading lots and lots of reports from experts, psychological assessment reports, psychiatric assessment reports, would get reports from CAMS about the children we're working with. But, you know, I wasn't informed enough. I didn't really know what it was like to be in the shoes of those adults and those children that I was working with. And yet, you know, from an empathy point of view, I really related to my clients. And I think that's why I was able to make a success of my career, because, you know, when I see people, I feel them, I feel their emotions. And if, you know, if they're sad, I'm sad. And, you know, if the people around me are happy and thriving, I'm thriving. But if they're not, then they're not. And I have to do something about it. And that really struck me for a long time, that despite having such a high level of experience in these issues, working with children and adults, I was still very, very uninformed about, you know, how big this issue was and the scale of it, and how little knowledge I had. And so I set about trying to make sure that I worked harder to understand the people I was working with, whether they're children or adults, but then also trying to understand better as a manager how to support people who, you know, were coming to me. So, you know, one of the key things was to adopt a very open policy where we were talking about neurodiversity. So when I started interviewing people, you know, I'd find a way to kind of sneak in there quite quickly that I had ADHD, and I'm very, very understanding and welcoming of neurodiversity. I want to be more informed. I want to know, you know, if someone wants to come and work for me, I want to know if that's an issue. And before I knew it, you know, the doors opened. There were so many people saying, well, actually, yes, I've got this and I've got that, and I've never told anyone. And then the second challenge arose when I started to work on, right, okay, so I've got ADHD. I know I'm managing people who've got all sorts of different conditions. Now, how do I make the workplace better for them? How do I go about making it work for them? Now, for me, going to management and telling them I've got ADHD, you know, I didn't ask for any adjustments, but there weren't any adjustments offered, because the reality is, you know, it was a learning curve for a lot of us. But the impression was, well, you've done well so far, so why would you need any adjustments? You know, your billing's fine, your time recording's fine, you're running a big team, you're good at marketing, networking, so what's the issue? But what they couldn't see was the mental health aspects behind that, because like Mark said, we are brilliant at masking. So when you see me, you see what I want you to see. I want you to see a strong, independent, well-regarded, fierce lawyer. I do all my own advocacy. I will never let myself come across weak in court. But the flip side of that is that that's part of my personality, where I can be an extrovert and I'm brilliant in social situations and I can be a social butterfly. But the other half is where I'm burnt out, I'm depressed, I've had suicidal ideations, I have to take medication to sleep, I have to take medication to survive. And that's all hidden because I choose to keep it hidden. I don't tell people that that's the other part that I grapple with. But then that's where the sympathy isn't there. So when I was vulnerable or when I needed to be supported, I wouldn't get that support because people only saw the half that I let them see, which was the strong Ravi who, if she's got an argument, she'll never back down. And, if she's in your corner, you'll win your battle. But then I had to deal with the other side of me. And then that becomes quite lonely, because when you hit rock bottom, there's nobody there, because they all assume you're strong, you don't need that support. And then at that point, it's very hard to reach out and ask for support because people only see you as, well, maybe you're just, I don't know, whatever you're doing, you're not that person. The Ravi we see is very, very, strong and can look after herself. And then I started to realize that a lot of people with ADHD do that. A lot of people have these kind of two worlds, the world where they're masking and they're out there, and then the world where everything is falling apart. And my world started to fall apart more and more after I had my daughter. So I had my son, and, suddenly I'd gone from only having to look after myself, only having to deal with myself and my own time blindness and, managing the structures around me, to suddenly catering for a human being and, constantly thinking about them. And then the second one arrived. And then the challenges with my second child, who now is going through a process of being assessed for autism and ADHD. The impact of me as someone with ADHD parenting a child with similar issues, that was what triggered, the big breakdown, if you like, when I realized that actually this is really unsustainable. I can't carry on like this. So even having an ADHD diagnosis, realizing that what I need to be able to do for this person who needs me at her beck and call and who needs me to be an informed parent. She needs a parent who can't go through cycles of brilliance and then burnout. She needed a consistent parent. So I really had to kind of pull back and change the way I thought about myself and how I thought I could manage life and situations. It's really difficult to be honest about your ADHD without feeling vulnerable and wondering if people are going to feel that you shouldn't be a lawyer. If you forget to turn up at hearings, you shouldn't be a lawyer. If you admit that you speed read and you do a lot of your prep in a hyper-focused state, maybe people won't want to instruct you. And so what I've started to do in the latter couple of years is I work with a lot of guardians, and I've started telling them openly about how I work. And I found that they're really understanding and they're really supportive. And they've started to kind of work with me and collaborate with, I know you do it this, Ravi, so we weren't going to chase you because we know you'll do it in your own time and you'll do it like this. And one guardian even said to me, look, I don't care if you send me things late or you don't send them on time, because I know that when it matters, when you get to court, I know that any child you're going to be representing, you're going to look after and you'll fight tooth and nail for them. So I found in being more honest about how I work and how I manage my my emails, my work, and how I interact with my clients, especially my professional clients, I found that there's more of a better understanding, and a lot of them are trying to support me. So I think it's really difficult to navigate a diagnosis. It's really difficult to navigate a diagnosis in later life. And I think there is just still so much work to be done within the profession. And I remember going to management saying that one of the people in my team has dyslexia and dyscalculia. And I really thought there needed to be some reasonable adjustments made. And all of the adjustments were refused on the basis that her performance was brilliant. She was time recording 200%. She was hitting a billing target. So why rock the boat if it doesn't need to be rocked? And I found that really interesting, because I couldn't get through to people who don't understand neurodiversity that it's not about whether you think the adjustments are deserved or not deserved, or should be in place or shouldn't be in place. You're not listening to what that person is saying that they feel pressured by, and how they could be better supported. So there's a lot of learning to be done on characterizing individual adjustments and not having a generic approach to helping people who are neurodiverse, having kind of very linear systems in place, that this is how we offer adjustments, and this is keeping it boxed. It's got to be very, very individual based, because if someone sat down with me and asked me what adjustments I need, and then they spoke to Paul, and then they spoke to Mark, I can probably guarantee that most of them wouldn't be the same. We're so different. And just prior to coming into this seminar, we were having a conversation, and I was quite struck about how different our ADHD is, and how differently it presents itself. And that's another thing to really kind of, where there's got to be a shift in thought process. ADHD is just an umbrella. What comes under it is what's important. And no person will have the same issues and the same difficulties. And then the overlap as well. It's only recently I've started to realize a lot of my tendencies, and this is because of my daughter's diagnosis. I have a lot of autistic tendencies, which I didn't see before, because I just assumed I've got ADHD and that's it. But actually, about 30% of my neurodivergence umbrella makeup, about 30 to 40% of it is autistic. A lot of my behaviors are autistic. So it's understanding that the terminology is really irrelevant. It's actually sitting down with the person and working out what makes them them, and then working out how they can be best supported and how they can be kept in the profession. Because it makes me sad that David, wanted to be a barrister, but has ended up finding a different route because he wasn't, I don't know if he was supported or not supported enough, but we can't lose brilliant people in the profession, and we can't put barriers up so that brilliant people can't come into the profession. Because as Mark said in one of his slides, everyone brings something different to the table, and we've really got to start seeing the bonuses of that and the qualities in that, especially within the legal profession, where we want it to be as diverse as possible, as wide-ranging as possible, because that's the only way we can truly accommodate all of the different client types we're going to work with. So I think, like Mark, I've probably gone over my time as well, so I'm going to stop there and hand over back to David. Thank you.
All right, we're now going to go over to Paul for a final word.
Hi, everyone. So I guess I will tell my story a bit as well, because I was also, like Ravi, late diagnosed with ADHD. And it was in some ways unexpected because of the journey that I had, where effectively I was a very gifted child at school, I would say, and performed academically really well, to such an extent that actually I think some people wouldn't give a diagnosis of ADHD where you actually haven't had difficulties at school, which I didn't. But actually I realized, looking back, the reasons for performing really well actually probably quite ADHD related. I had an insatiable curiosity about the world and a creativity with how my thoughts worked, and thought very quickly and hyper focused on studying. And that enabled me to go to Cambridge and study law. And again, I think looking back, although I was more distracted at Cambridge than I was at school, I was still able to use my hyper focus to be able to perform well in the Cambridge exams, which luckily for me were just 3 hours per subject at the end of the year, one exam, write everything you know. It was a hyper focus heaven, and I managed to do again well at uni and become a barrister. And again, becoming a barrister, the pupillage process and all of that, I think ADHD, looking back, probably helped me. I'm very good at talking, thinking on my feet, being quick, all those things. And therefore I became a barrister, despite, as some might say it, ADHD being ordinarily a barrier to that. Then what happened in practice was, over time, I think, like David said, my promise not being met, I think. My chambers were like, well, we've got this guy who's got a first from Cambridge, on paper really great, but his output is just really chaotic. and sometimes brilliant, but a lot of the time patchy in terms of performance. And this went on for some time. And then after about 8 or 9 years of being a barrister, it very much came to a head. And I didn't know by this point I had ADHD, but my chambers basically said I had to improve my billing to a level that I knew I couldn't achieve, or I had to leave. And at that point, some of the kind of thoughts I'd had about ADHD and that I might have it started to come to the fore. I started reading more about it, and then I went and got a diagnosis. And I was lucky enough to be able to pay to go privately for that, because obviously many people can't afford a quick diagnosis, which is a major issue for a lot of people. And that diagnosis was not, to put it mildly, well received in my chambers. My old chambers, I should hasten to add, not Garden Court, who were a lot less understanding. One of the members of chambers who'd sort of seen himself as my mentor, but had, I think, almost felt slightly put out that I hadn't risen to the promise that he thought I should hold. He sarcastically said to me after the diagnosis came in, I see you've got your doctor's chitty note, or something like that, which I thought was really not particularly nice. But basically the chambers then left me alone to carry on doing my thing, but then collapsed about 6 months later, at the time of COVID. And then I came to Garden Court. I think a lot of people have asked in the questions about disclosure, and I decided not to disclose at the time of interview, because I didn't, as I see, want it to cloud the impression of me, I suppose. That was my choice then. But then I did, about 6 months into coming to Chambers, I did then disclose and ask for some very basic reasonable adjustments, particularly around help with billing and some understanding on emails and reminders and how to communicate with me and things like that. So for instance, sending me a WhatsApp message is more likely to get my attention than the stream and flood of emails in my inbox. And Chambers has been really, really good at that. Everything I've asked for, they've given, and it really has enabled me to stay in the profession when otherwise that would be quite difficult for me, I think. In terms of why should we have neurodiverse lawyers? Why should we make the profession accessible to the neurodiverse? To me, I have a theory. This is my experience. It may be others, that if you imagine a performance, a graph with performance on, sort of neurotypical people are like this. You know, the difference between their top performance in a certain area and their bottom performance isn't maybe that big. Whereas for neurodiverse people, it's like, or for me at least, it's like this, you know, in terms of what I'm good at, I'm really good at, and what I'm bad, I'm really not very good at all. And I think we need to be better as a legal profession at getting neurodiverse people in, because what they're good at is amazing, and they bring something special that we actually need in our profession. And that, therefore, we have to enable them in a system to either do less of the stuff they're not very good at, or to work through that. And it's very interesting to listen to David saying about your amazing ability to read, to read or write, you know, so many pages in a day. I don't have those written skills. And for me, my very good performance is advocacy. My not so good performance is written work. And I think it's an aspect of the legal profession that we sort of demand a Renaissance person level of skills, lots of different skills, whereas actually there's no necessary reason why someone who'd be really great at advocacy would also be great at drafting. And I feel we need to get better at being able to unhitch the different aspects of the profession and let people do what they're good at. And it's quite interesting at Garden Court, we've got this example of me and David, where I think it seems like our skills are opposite. David really enjoys research and written work and is really good at it. And I really enjoy spoken advocacy and court work, and I'm good at it. And I'm not so good at the written work, and trying to like get less of that work and do the things that I'm good at has been part of my journey. And the diagnosis has really helped unlock that. I tried taking some of the drugs and didn't really like them, so I'm unmedicated. But the diagnosis has been incredibly helpful for self-knowledge of knowing what I'm good at. And crucially, that I am good at things. The things that I'm good at, I'm really good at. And to therefore be less hard on myself for the things that I'm not so good at. And for me as an ADHD person, as I say, it's advocacy and cross-examination. I've been in situations where, in the employment tribunal is one where I really enjoy, because it's quite lengthy cross-examination on quite technical points sometimes. And there's been many occasions where it's been, I do a lot of trade union work for employees and for also employees that can't necessarily afford much in the way of lawyers. And I'm often against employers who've got, literally 2 or 3 city solicitors sitting behind a top barrister, employment barrister, and I can see they've written out all of their questions and everything's prepared. And I will start sometimes a one-day cross-examination with no questions at all, no notes, just read the folder, understand it, and then go. And it enables me to go into a state of hyper-focus that can be really incredible for cross-examination, where I look across and I see, sometimes I see my opponent, and when they've written out their questions, my client will say something that I'm like, oh God, they could go down that avenue. And they literally don't even follow it because their questions that's not in their list of questions, it's not in their preparation. Whereas I can be totally in the moment, totally in tune with the witness, and in a sort of grand battle almost of wills, where I'll be able to take a point and then run with it. And there's been many different occasions where that has won out, and where that level and type of cross-examination has been the thing that's really made the difference. And those times are incredible. I think also it's worth noting as well, the thing we often need I think something we need more in the profession is creativity and a yearning for justice. It's one of the noted traits of neurodiverse people that we have a strong sense of justice. And actually, I think somewhat ironically, I think that's something the current legal profession is really lacking. Actually, there isn't a stronger sense of justice amongst lawyers as there should be. Our profession has been significantly captured by moneyed interests who are using the law for their own ends and not actually seeking justice. And many of the people I know in the legal profession who truly do yearn for justice and put their all to it and give their hyper focus to that are neurodiverse people. And frankly, we need more of them. We also need people who are creative, because our society is about to be, or is coming into a time of great change with the climate and ecological crisis, for instance, as a very strong one. Our legal system is not in any way keeping up with that change, and we need lawyers who are creative and think differently to navigate that change. And for me, that's been really an important part of my neurodiversity. So 5 years ago, I founded Lawyers for Nature to begin to transform the relationship between law and nature and campaign for the rights of nature. And I don't think that I would be one of the key barristers in the world of imagining what rights of nature could be like and what a legal system in tune with nature could be like. I would not be doing that if it wasn't for my neurodiversity, if it wasn't for my ADHD. It's that creativity, that thinking differently, that quick thinking that I think has led to me going down that route. And frankly, we need more people, more lawyers doing that for all different aspects of how our law interacts with society. So that's why I think we need more neurodiverse lawyers, and maybe a couple of ways that we can try and encourage them. Obviously, the usual reasonable adjustments, but also crucially, allowing lawyers to do the tasks, allowing neurodiverse lawyers to do the tasks they are actually good at, and to minimize and to help them with the tasks that they are not, and to understand that we're not all necessarily equally good at all tasks. And I think that scale of me and David really does illustrate that quite well, I think, in terms of our different things we prefer in our roles. So yeah, I've kept my time, I think, just about, which is unusual. And I don't know if we have any time for questions, David, or if that's the end of the session, because we've got loads in there, haven't we?
Yes, we've had a lot of very good questions, and unfortunately we don't really have time to answer them because we've already gone over time. One thing that's been asked several times by different people, and so I think this is probably the only one we do have time to answer, what's been asked several times by different people is about disclosure of your diagnosis to employers or prospective employers. And some people in the Q&A have talked about their own bad experiences of disclosing and getting a bad reaction. So I think perhaps if anyone wants to chime in on that issue of disclosure to employers, or obviously in the case of self-employed barristers to chambers. Paul, I think you did address that
yeah, I've already sort of
earlier.
done that. I mean, I think it slightly depends on who your audience is. Like the chambers like Garden Court, I think you can expect a reasonably good reception to it. My last chambers, that was a civil commercial chancery set, I predicted they would not take well to it, and they didn't. So I think it slightly depends who your audience is.
I think, sorry, just to add, I think because there's a lot of awareness and a lot of talk around neurodiversity, especially in the last, say, 12 to 18 months, I think it's going to get better to be open about these issues when going for job interviews. And I know that one of our speakers who was going to attend today, I think he was going to talk about that. So from Neurodiversity in Law, because they offer a lot of support to young people coming into the profession on how to share their diagnoses at which point. And I know at my previous firm, we had a mechanism where if you were offered the job, you would then be sent out a form in which you had to set out if you had any disabilities. And I wondered whether that should go out with the interview form, so that, you know, you have an opportunity, or you give the people that you're about to interview an opportunity to make clear from the offset that there are, you know, matters that they want to disclose. So there's a big change needed, but I think the change is slowly starting to come about. Yeah.
Can I just add yeah, I would echo the hopeful message that I think I've certainly noticed that there is a bit of a shift. It feels like a shift in weather. There is an increasing receptiveness to disclosures of neurodivergent conditions, but also an increasing awareness. I know the NHS launched a task force on ADHD. I think 2 weeks ago, because it is the most researched or most searched online term on the NHS website. But we're looking at the systemic delays in assessments and diagnosis. And I think it's really important to think about when, you know, organizations trying to become more inclusive. People may have these conditions but not be diagnosed through no lack of trying and not through their own doing, and in particular Black and Brown well, people in the legal profession, but particularly women in the legal profession, are less likely to be diagnosed, or whether or not they're in the legal profession. But we have quite you know, historically problematic diagnostic criteria, yeah, so I think that it's important that we look through look at this issue through an intersectional lens as well. And if your organization is great at dealing with anti-racism, but isn't looking at neurodiversity through the lens of anti-racism as well, then they're not doing enough. I think it's another thing that organizations should be looking at and just be aware of. But I'm hopeful, like others, that we're moving in the right direction, and with increased awareness, increased discourse, and transparency, times are hopefully changing for the better.
Thanks everyone for all of those great insights. Thank you to everyone for attending, and thank you to all of our panelists. I apologize to the many people who asked very good and insightful questions that we just have not had time to answer.
I've tried to answer some of them, David, really quickly.
I think the amount of questions, the number of people in this webinar really shows how much interest there is in this topic, and maybe it's a stake for a more detailed Q&A another day, because I think it's I've been a bit blown away by the amount of detailed, interesting questions, to be honest.
Can I just say that I've emailed Anush and asked if we can have a copy of the questions And then when these slides or when any information is sent out by Garden Court, I think we can try and see if we can get some answers or some information to the questions asked. And we can, you know, maybe in a few days, we can put some information out there for some of the questions.
I think that's a very good idea,
helps.
because we've had some very good questions, particularly about how how being neurodivergent as a lawyer can affect your work with neurodivergent clients. And there was a good question about trauma-informed lawyering, which is something I'm very interested in. So there's a lot, actually, that's something that we haven't really had time to touch on. There's a lot that could be said about that. That could be a whole session in itself. So yeah, there's a lot of good questions. There was a good question about the Court of Protection as well. I thought that was very interesting. It's not my area, but that was a very good question. So yeah, so we've had a lot of great questions. So as I say, if you I apologize if you've spent a lot of time composing a question and we haven't had time to get to it, but I agree with Ravi's suggestion. If it is possible to retain the questions, that would be that would be good. So thank you all very much for attending. Thank you to Anusha and her team for organizing this excellent webinar, and I hope that it's been of assistance. I think we've all been a lot more candid and honest about professional struggles and so on than is the norm in the profession, and I think that's hopefully been helpful and valuable for people to get an unvarnished look at how it actually is. All right. Thank you all very much.